Thinking back to the shows I enjoyed as a child, one that I don't think got as much love as, well, that I don't see coming up in conversation so much, is Visionaries. The tagline for Visionaries was Knights of the Magical Light. And what I especially enjoyed about that show is it did something which I was always very keen on, being able to transform into an animal. I always find that a very enjoyable premise, and it's nice to see it these days. Though I think the Visionaries, it didn't run for very long. I think there were only 14 episodes of the animated series. I don't think the toy line was particularly popular, so I think it's perhaps an overlooked series from that time. And looking back on it, it had some elements that were a bit more sophisticated, I think, than a lot of the other shows. Of just continuing plot lines, for instance. Something takes place in episode 3 and then it gets referenced in episode 8, just as a throwaway remark. So it was something that I think rewarded an absorbed viewer. Now, I say this is a show that is somewhat underseen. I don't like to refer to things as underrated or indeed overrated, because frankly I've got no idea what would be an overrated show, because that suggests there's a correct level of rating, and I don't know what that is.
I mean, there's shows that people don't talk about. Immediately there were shows like Noir and Witch Hunter Robin, which immediately jumped to mind as anime shows that kind of really didn't get the popularity that I thought they deserved. But, that's very hit and miss. But I'd also make a point for shows coming out now. As a parent, I've kind of, by default, kept my foot in the animated world. Even though I still watch anime, I still have a Crunchyroll subscription and things like that. But shows like Kipo and the Age of Wonder Beast, Gravity Falls, I'm just trying to think of some of the others. Kid Cosmic, the Craig McCracken show. I mean, he created Powerpuff Girls, which was a big one for my eldest, and now my youngest is kind of watching all these other shows at the moment. And they're fantastic, and I just never hear anybody ever talk about them. Now, that could be because of the actual circles I move in, but yeah, not a lot of people kind of talk about them. However, if I'm going to, again, stick my neck out and put my name to a show, one I think everybody should see that has just kind of flown under the radar and doesn't have a decent release as far as I'm aware right now, and that was an anime called Now and Then, Here and There. It's an absolutely beautiful show. It kind of really hits those action beats, but in that very late 80s, early 90s kind of way. But yeah, Now and Then, Here and There, really, really good. Hopefully somebody will put a decent release of it out there at some point.
So I'm going to cheat on this one and pick a film. Titan AE. It's an interesting experimental time capsule of that period of transition in computer animation's infancy. It's got a great soundtrack, memorable characters and lines, and I still suspect the reason Digital Anvil cut the original full-length intro to Freelancer back in 2003 was to avoid being sued over it being a direct carbon copy of the intro to this film, because Chris Roberts is a talentless hack without an original idea in his brain.
Animated show I think is the most underrated. So a couple of shout outs here we covered it on our podcast actually, Harley Quinn, which has an over the top opening episode, but if you're not put off by that, it's one of the best and most laugh out loud shows in years. It's hilarious, it's fantastic, I really recommend it. And the character arcs just get more interesting as you get into that. Duncanville, really hard to find in the UK, but it's really funny and sweet and has a classic Simpsons vibe to it, so I recommend that too. Although when I thought about this more deeply, I think they're probably more underseen as opposed to underrated. So I think people who have seen those shows probably do rate them quite highly. It's just hard to access. So my pick is actually Disenchantment, which is a very high profile show, Matt Groening's new series after Simpsons and Futurama. But I don't think it gets the props it deserves, really. It's I've written an article saying this, but to summarize it quickly for this Collecting Confessions, is I think is a lot funnier than people give it credit for. And actually, as the show settles more into its plot and stories and like serious character arcs, it weirdly gets funnier than when it moves away from traditional jokes and sitcom style episodes, when it just relaxes into its groove. I think it just gets stronger and stronger, and the stories and characters that I really connected with and empathized with really strongly. Just by being in this magical, fanciful world, like, it's really relatable and sweet and touching in places. So I wonder if people were expecting more of The Simpsons, but actually for me it's got more of a Futurama style vibe, which I'm totally down with.
Perhaps I find it remarkable, not irritating, but certainly interesting, that Transformers has remained such a prominent, has retained a place in popular culture, to the extent of continuing to populate blockbuster mainstream movies. So perhaps it is interesting to see the kind of online commentary about the G1 Transformers TV series, and I wonder if maybe the gatekeeping around that show is somewhat excessive.
I mean, when it comes to overrated shows, okay, you know what, I'll go with the bugbear kind of thing. Shows like One Piece, Naruto, Bleach, and there's a whole bunch of others, but they're the kind of three that really come to mind. They were called the Big Three at one point. And I can see how good they can be. They're just not consistently good all the time, and certainly not to get the recognition that they do. Like, for instance, I mean, Naruto is notorious, Bleach was notorious for this, where they would have whole seasons of filler. And it would be like, when are we going to get back to the main plot? And I get it, sometimes, especially when, sort of like creators get sick and they can't kind of meet the demand of it coming through. But, yeah, no, for the kind of plaudits that shows like Bleach and One Piece have, there's so much absolute garbage in the middle of it that I don't understand how it's maintained that level and how much people still love it to this day. I mean, One Piece, arguably the biggest selling comic book of all time. Okay, maybe with the exception of like Superman, Batman, but it's certainly up there. It's in the conversation for one of the biggest, certainly within my lifetime. And I think sort of like, and certainly if you look at the lifetime of that manga, and how little time it has had compared to Superman and Batman and your Spider-Mans, it's an absolute revelation. But yeah, I don't understand how people still regard it as one of the greatest shows, and yet it has so much baggage and filler in between seasons. I don't get it.
Ooh, most overrated animated show for me. And this is heavily qualified. Let me explain it first before anyone gets angry. Is Family Guy. Now, don't get me wrong. It can be a really funny show, and I'm not trying to discredit the show. Like, when it first came out, I remember it felt really fresh and exciting, and the cutaways were great. But after a while, the cutaway jokes became kind of stale, which I think, to be fair, the show acknowledged, and they seem to do less of that now. But I just don't like I think some of the humour's a bit on the cruel side, simply, or the slightly obvious side. So I just don't like that aspect to it. And like, now I'm older, like, things with like where I connect more with the characters have a bigger impact on me. But I'm not totally trashing the show. It can be, don't get me wrong, it can be funny.
When it comes to visually spectacular animation, I think it's important to think about this at the time you see it. What had you seen, and what was your sort of frame of reference? So I've got two ideas about visually spectacular animation. One of them, pardon me being a kind of a basic bitch here, The Lion King from 1994. Now, this was at a time when Disney was pushing the envelope in terms of 3D animation. The Lion King wasn't the first film to utilise this, but I think it was one that turned it into something truly spectacular. It was to see that as something that was clearly animated and yet felt alive, felt lustrous, and it was well timed, it was textured, and of course combined with that extraordinary immortal soundtrack, it's remains something that I think is really striking and really compelling. I mean, when I visited Africa, every morning I had playing in my head, Ba Sigwanyan Habadisibo, and I think that's testament to the impact that The Lion King made. The less said about the remake, the better. More recently, I finally saw, this is perhaps another basic choice, I finally saw Akira, which, from 1986, earlier than The Lion King, but my God, that was something just extraordinary. I remember watching, actually had the good fortune of seeing that in a cinema, and there were multiple points during Akira when I was just going like, which I think is a pretty good indication of finding something visually spectacular. And here I am correcting myself because Akira was actually 1988. Sorry about that.
I mean, the gorgeous visuals, straight away Akira again. However, I don't want to be like a one-trick pony. So kind of if I'm looking at films in recent years, and bearing in mind that I'm of an age now where recent years could be anything since the start of the 21st century. So if I was going to go one that kind of really made me sit up, even though the film's a bit of nonsense, I'd probably go with Redline from 2009, Studio Madhouse. They always make beautiful shows. They're kind of up there with Kyoto Animation, and their Violet Evergarden. It's just absolutely gorgeous looking anime. But this one, it kind of, as I said, the show, the actual film itself is full of nonsense. I'm sorry, I've got my cat in the background kind of meowing at me. But it's it is nonsense, but it really kind of got across that idea of speed when the races were happening, and they were so exhilarating and so visually mesmerizing that you couldn't take your eyes off those moments. And they're the bits that stick out. I couldn't tell you much about the story except for, it's about people racing cars. But that's all you need. It was one where you could feel the G-force coming through the screen as they took corners and were head-to-heads coming to finishing lines. Absolutely fantastic. Definitely well worth a watch if you like something that's just pretty vapid, but pretty nonetheless.
So, when computer-generated stuff was first taking off, there were some hits. I'm thinking the likes of Reboot, especially its later seasons, and there were some big misses. But after a certain point, everyone kind of started trying to copy Toy Story, and the Pixar or DreamWorks aesthetics became ubiquitous. But over in Japan, we eventually got a much more interesting piece of work in the early 2000s that blended traditional 2D art styles with some lovely computer-generated work in ways that really contributed to the otherworldly feel a bunch of the scenes were meant to evoke. I am, of course, talking about the Ghost in the Shell sequel project, Innocence. Like its predecessor, it loosely adapted one of the arcs of the manga. The film has some fantastic visuals in places, which do a wonderful job of capturing some of the look of a lot of the later manga volumes in its visualizations of the hacking, particularly in the climax of the film. Not to mention it pulling off a scene evoking the experience of a first-person corridor shooter before live-action films would get obsessed with that as wearable cameras became more of a thing. But the show-stealing moment has to be the parade scene. Something other forms of media have tried to evoke in their own cyberpunk worlds, most notable recently being Cyberpunk 2077, which I think did it beautifully in its own way, while still drawing clear inspiration. The music, of course, is always a highlight of these films, and this scene, it is no exception. But combined with the visuals here, with the crowds, the children running through the alleyways, the giant parade floats, the towering buildings circled by the flocks of seagulls, it's really hard to describe how seeing that for the first time made me feel. Watching the giant marionettes parade through the streets thronged with people, it was something really unique that stood out and gave me a sense of reassurance that there were creators thinking of more ways to utilise this new technology that didn't have to fit inside the same Hollywood box.
The most visually spectacular animation for me is Across the Spider-Verse. At the time of recording, a very recent movie, but it's just fantastic. It's got like everything you could want from a visual perspective. It's got all these different styles and vibrant color schemes and all that kind of stuff, and the very superficially exciting stuff. But what's great as well is even the quieter moments are brilliantly or visually fantastic too. Like in Gwen's story, these watercolors like seeping and bleeding like into each other around her is very clever. Things like the way it's shot, like the upside down heart-to-heart scene with a couple of the main protagonists, which already feels iconic even though the movie's just come out. It's just all fantastic and looks amazing. Yeah, it's all 100% in service to the story and the characters rather than just for show. It just visually is, for me, it's the perfect movie. Other shout outs though, even though it's maybe not the best film, the Red Line anime movie is just on purely visual perspective is amazing. Like the amount of work that went into making it is equivalent to what Akira went through. It's mad. Like you'll never see anything like it. The recent film Suzume is fantastic too. That deserves a shout out too. That's visually spectacular, but a better movie than Red Line 2, I'd argue. But anyhow.